In any case, what I am anxious about is substituting transformations of the understanding for the history of the discoveries of knowledge. Therefore I have, in appearance at least, a completely different attitude to Mr. Chomsky about creativity, because for me, it is a matter of effacing the dilemma of the knowing subject, while for him, it is a matter of allowing the dilemma of the speaking subject to reappear. But if he has made it reappear, if he has described it, it is because he can do so. The linguists have for a long time now analyzed language as a system with a collective value. The understanding as a collective totality of rules allowing such and such a knowledge to be produced in a certain period has hardly been studied until now. Nevertheless, it presents some fairly positive characteristics to the observer. Take for example medicine at the end of the 18th century, read 20 medical works, it doesn't matter which, of the years 1770 to 1780, then 20 others from the years 1820 to 1830, and I would say, quite at random, that in 40 or 50 years everything had changed. What one talked about, the way one talked about it, not just the remedies, of course, not just the maladies and their classifications, but the outlook itself. Who was responsible for that? Who was the author of it? It is artificial, I think, to say Bitchet, or even to expand a little and to say the first anatomical clinicians. It's a matter of a collective and complex transformation of medical understanding in its practice and its rules. And this transformation is far from a negative phenomenon, it is the suppression of a negativity, the effacement of an obstacle, the disappearance of prejudices, the abandonment of old myths, the retreat of irrational beliefs, an access finally freed to experience and to reason. It represents the application of an entirely new trial, with its choices and exclusions, a new play with its own rules, decisions, and limitations. With its own inner logic, its parameters and its blind alleys, all of which lead to the modification of the point of origin. And it is in this functioning, that the understanding itself exists. So, if one studies the history of knowledge, one sees that there are two broad directions of analysis. According to one has to show how, under what conditions, and for what reasons, the understanding modifies itself in its formative rules, without passing through an original inventor discovering the truth, and according to the other, one has to show how the working of the rules of an understanding can produce in an individual new and unpublished knowledge. Here my aim rejoins, with imperfect methods, and in a quite inferior mode, Mr. Chomsky's project, accounting for the fact that with a few rules or definite element, unknown totalities, never even produced, can be brought to light by individuals. To resolve this problem, Mr. Chomsky has to reintroduce the dilemma of the subject in the field of grammatical analysis. To resolve an analogous problem in the field of history with which I am involved, one has to do the opposite, in a way, to introduce the point of view of understanding, of its rules, of its systems, of its transformations of totalities in the game of individual knowledge. Here and there the problem of creativity cannot be resolved in the same way, or rather, it can't be formulated in the same terms, given the state of disciplines inside which it is put.
I think in part we're slightly talking at cross purposes, because of a different use of the term creativity. In fact, I should say that my use of the term creativity is a little bit idiosyncratic, and therefore the onus falls on me in this case, not on you. But when I speak of creativity, I'm not attributing to the concept the notion of value that is normal when we speak of creativity. That is, when you speak of scientific creativity, you're speaking, properly, of the achievements of a Newton. But in the context in which I have been speaking about creativity, it's a normal human act. I'm speaking of the kind of creativity that any child demonstrates when he's able to come to grips with a new situation, to describe it properly, react to it properly, tell one something about it, think about it in a new fashion for him, and so on. I think it's appropriate to call those acts creative, but of course without thinking of those acts as being the acts of a Newton. In fact, it may very well be true that creativity in the arts or the sciences, that which goes beyond the normal, may really involve properties of, well, I would also say of human nature, which may not exist fully developed in the mass of mankind, and may not constitute part of the normal creativity of everyday life. Now my belief is that science can look forward to the problem of normal creativity as a topic that it can perhaps incorporate within itself. But I don't believe, and I suspect you will agree, that science can look forward, at least in the reasonable future, to coming to grips with true creativity, the achievements of the great artist and the great scientist. It has no hope of accommodating these unique phenomena within its grasp. It's the lower levels of creativity that I've been speaking of. Now, as far as what you say about the history of science is concerned, I think that's correct, and illuminating and particularly relevant in fact to the kinds of enterprise that I see lying before us in psychology and linguistics and the philosophy of the mind. That is, I think there are certain topics that have been repressed or put aside during the scientific advances of the past few centuries. For example, this concern with low-level creativity that I'm referring to was really present in Descartes also. For example, when he speaks of the difference between a parrot, who can mimic what is said, and a human, who can say new things that are appropriate to the situation, and when he specifies that as being the distinctive property that designates the limits of physics and carries us into the science of the mind, to use modern terms, I think he really is referring to the kind of creativity that I have in mind, and I quite agree with your comments about the other sources of such notions. Well, these concepts, even in fact the whole notion of the organization of sentence structure, were put aside during the period of great advances that followed from Sir William Jones and others and the development of comparative philology as a whole. But now, I think, we can go beyond that period, when it was necessary to forget and to pretend that these phenomena did not exist, and to turn to something else. In this period of comparative philology and also, in my view, structural linguistics, and much of behavioral psychology, and in fact much of what grows out of the empiricist tradition in the study of mind and behavior, it is possible to put aside those limitations, and bring into our consideration just those topics that animated a good deal of the thinking and speculation of the 17th and 18th centuries, and to incorporate them within a much broader, and I think deeper science of man, that will give a fuller, although it is certainly not expected to give a complete understanding to such notions as innovation and creativity and freedom in the production of new entities, new elements of thought and behavior within some system of rule and schematism. Those are concepts that I think we can come to grips with.
Oh, I don't believe that the problem of personal experience is so very important. No, I believe that there is in reality quite a strong similarity between what Mr. Chomsky said, and what I tried to show. In other words, there exist in fact only possible creations, possible innovations. One can only, in terms of language or of knowledge, produce something new by putting into play a certain number of rules, which will define the acceptability or the grammaticality of these statements, or which will define, in the case of knowledge, the scientific character of the statements. Thus, we can roughly say that linguists before Mr. Chomsky mainly insisted on the rules of construction of statements and less on the innovation, represented by every new statement, or the hearing of a new statement. And in the history of science, or in the history of thought, we placed more emphasis on individual creation, and we had kept aside, and left in the shadows these communal, general rules, which obscurely manifest themselves through every scientific discovery, every scientific invention, and even every philosophical innovation. And to that degree, when I no doubt wrongly believe that I am saying something new, I am nevertheless conscious of the fact that in my statement there are rules at work, not only linguistic rules, but also epistemological rules, and those rules characterize contemporary knowledge,